Why is it that for decades, we as a society love to sit in a dark room and be tormented by our greatest fears? Why do the thoughts of horror and death make us feel so alive? Today, we'll visit each generation's definition of horror, as well as some films that represent them, because to know what scares a society is to know that society.
If any of you will spend the next 12 hours in this house, I'll give you each $10,000. Or your next of kin in case you don't survive.
Fear was the first emotion that bound human beings together. Before there were cameras, there were shadows on cave walls. Early myths and religious stories weren't designed to entertain. They were tools of survival. And make no mistake, modern horror films echo a similar purpose today. In the absence of science, storytelling helped our ancestors explain disasters, disease, and death. Monsters, demons, and curses were metaphors for what couldn't be understood. The Mesopotamians had Pazuzu, a wind demon blamed for illness. The Greeks told tales of Medusa and the Minotaur, physical manifestations of punishment and chaos. The Norse warned of Ragnarok, the inevitable end of days. These stories didn't just describe fear, they gave it a shape. And in giving fear form, people could face it. Horror's first purpose, then and now, was understanding. To make the invisible visible, to express the unspeakable, and to reassure us that even darkness could be understood.
Book of the Dead. The book served as a passageway to the evil worlds beyond. It was written long ago, when the seas ran red with blood.
Cinema was officially born when the Lumiere brothers had the first commercial public screening in Paris on December 28, 1895. 1 year later, in 1896, the horror genre was born with the great Georges Méliès' Le Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil. At just over 3 minutes, Méliès' creation reshaped imagination itself. Through inventive trickery, he conjured devils, ghosts, and witches, drawn from ancient myth and Gothic lore. Visions that forever changed what the moving image could be. This marked the beginning of the Silent Shadows era, our first true era of horror films, lasting until the introduction of sound in the late 20s and early 30s. Some of my favorite films from this era include the German expressionist gem, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Wine in 1920. With its themes of power, manipulation, and insanity, created in a wounded post-war Germany, its warped sets and unreliable narration mirrored a society grappling with trauma and distrust. Or how about the 1922 early docu-style pioneer, Haxan, directed by Benjamin Christensen, which used shocking imagery and dramatic reenactments to examine the roots of witch hunts. Its true horror wasn't the witches or demons, but how fear, religion, and power work together to control and punish. And finally, no list of this era is complete without the mention of F.W. Murnau's 1922 Symphony of Horror, Nosferatu, a landmark film at the time. Murnau reimagined Dracula as a symbol of disease and decay, with its pale, skeletal monster creeping through the shadows and released into a world still recovering from war and influenza. It captured the era's fear of contamination, decay, and the foreign unknown. As you can see, we're beginning to see a pattern here. Films of the Silent Shadows era dealt with the unraveling of the human psyche after World War I and rapid modernization. So we could say that horror films in the Silent Age were born from silence itself. The silence after war, after faith, after certainty. Those twisted sets and ghostly faces were more than art. They were Europe's broken mirror, reflecting a world learning that the greatest terror comes not from the dark outside, but the darkness within the mind.
Well, Denham, the airplane's got him. Oh, no. It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast.
Then, By the 1930s, horror was beginning to become a true spectacle, stepping into the spotlight and creating some of the most iconic monsters in history. This was the age when audiences no longer feared the abstract, and instead feared and pitied the creature. The 1930s and 40s is known as the Monsters era of horror film, sometimes called the Golden Age of Horror. The Great Depression had left millions struggling. Hunger, unemployment, and disillusionment haunted real life more than any movie ever could. Audiences didn't want realism, they were tired of it, and instead wanted an escape. Providing this much-needed relief was Universal Pictures' stable of legendary creatures such as Dracula, the Mummy, and the Invisible Man. They weren't just monsters either. They were metaphors for loneliness, alienation, and the pain of being misunderstood. None more so than the monster in James Whale's 1931 masterpiece, Frankenstein. And if you haven't seen Bride of Frankenstein either, I highly recommend them both. These films ooze with atmosphere and style in every frame. The iconic Boris Karloff's performance gave the monster a soul, confused, gentle, and punished for existing.
It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
It's alive became more than a catchphrase. It was a question. What does it mean to create life and then reject it? Any of the Universal monster films of this era will give you an intimate peek into the societal fears of this era. So I want to recommend a film that was made to directly compete with Universal's dominance, and that is 1942's Cat People, directed by Jacques Tourneur and conceived by maverick film producer Val Lewton, whose contributions to understated and intelligent horror would go on to influence cinematic sensibilities to this day. So much so that Cat People is credited with creating the first modern jump scare in cinema history, affectionately called the Lewton Bus. This film, like the other creature features, painted a portrait of society that exposed a monster created from repression and alienation. Though born in America, the Universal monster era was deeply indebted to German expressionism. Many European filmmakers had fled Germany, bringing with them their shadowy, ambiguous, and operatic visual style. These films blended European melancholy with Hollywood myth-making, creating a uniquely cinematic form of emotional realism. Our fears of scientific progress, foreign differences, and repressed desires show that humanity's darkest enemy was itself. Weary audiences would enter theaters to watch a monster carrying the pain they all felt. A generation haunted by loss and economic despair were comforted by stories that made them believe they weren't the only ones who sometimes felt like monsters.
The Second World War involved every continent on the globe, and men turned to science for new devices of warfare, which reached an unparalleled peak in their capacity for destruction. And now, fought with the terrible weapons of super science, menacing all mankind and every creature on Earth, comes the War of the World.
By now, the Second World War had ended. Humanity had split the atom, reached new technological heights, and witnessed the unimaginable devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Science was both savior and destroyer, and horror became the language to express that contradiction. That's right, we're now entering the atomic age of horror. This era spans the 1950s and early 60s and is marked by space travel, radiation, and Cold War paranoia. A perfect introduction film to this era is none other than the groundbreaking 1954 kaiju craze catalyst, Godzilla, directed by Ishiro Honda and starring the great Takashi Shimura, who originally carved out his place in cinema history thanks to his many collaborations with Akira Kurosawa. In the pantheon of giant movie monsters, this beast truly stands alone. More than just a metaphor for nuclear devastation, this movie monster is literally created by American hydrogen bomb tests in the Pacific. Western audiences saw entertainment. Japanese audiences saw their collective grief made flesh. Now for those of us like me that love a good alien flick, I'll point you in the direction of 1954's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, directed by Don Siegel. This film perfectly reflected the psychological tension of the Cold War and McCarthyism at the time. A film where alien invaders are replacing humans, and it's too late to stop them because they're already here.
Look! You fools! You're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! Our wives, our children, everyone! They're here already! You're next! You're next! You're next! You're next!
The fear of infiltration, conformity, and loss of ideals was made perfectly clear through every frame of this film. The enemy could be anyone, even your brother, sister, or neighbor. And one last one I want to throw out there, just because I think it's a lot of fun, is 1958's The Blob, in which an amorphous monster devours small-town America, mirroring fears of invasion and scientific curiosity outpacing human capacity. It's B-movie fun at its most inventive, and also features the first starring role for the king of cool, Steve McQueen. Visually, the horror of the 1950s contrasted sharply with the gothic gloom before it. Suburbs, laboratories, and white coats replaced dark castles and crypts, but beneath this shiny post-war optimism, the shadows persisted. In this era, horror finally looked humanity in the eye and said, "You are your own apocalypse."
The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths. In particular, Sally Hardesty and her invalid brother, Franklin. It is all the more tragic in that they were young. But had they lived very, very long lives, they could not have expected, nor would they have wished to see as much of the mad and macabre as they were to see that day. For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare. The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
The next era we are covering is perhaps the most terrifying, and that is the psycho slasher era, covering a large range of the 1960s to the 80s. This was the age when horror got real. The 1960s shattered the illusion of safety. The nightmares were no longer confined to the movies, and instead were broadcast on the news every night, most likely during dinner time. Wars, mass shootings, assassinations, right alongside your mac and cheese. It was kicked off by a film that broke all of the rules at the time in 1960, and also inspired the naming of this era, and that's Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, starring Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins, whose turn as Norman Bates was disturbingly human. A quiet man, polite, fragile, and so very broken.
It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
He embodied an evil that dwelled behind an ordinary, clean-cut facade, giving us more than a few memorable scenes. This film paved the way for our next recommendation, Italian masterpiece Profondo Rosso, or Deep Red, 1975, directed by Giallo great Dario Argento. The film's play with gender roles and psychological fragmentation echoed changing social dynamics of the 1970s, and the killer's fractured identity became a metaphor for a culture questioning its own balance. Gone is the understated violence of cinema's past, and in its place, hyper-gory depictions of blood-soaked kills that turn the stomach and leave an audience squirming in their seats. The camera no longer looked away, especially in regards to a film that must be mentioned, Halloween, 1978, directed by John Carpenter, starring Scream Queen Jamie Lee Curtis, whose mother Janet Leigh also has been mentioned thanks to her work in Psycho. With Halloween, we were introduced to the mask, blank, motionless, unstoppable, horror in its purest form, no longer needing explanation or justification. It simply was.
I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
The suburban streets of America were once symbols of safety and had now become corridors of dread. Another of Carpenter's films we have to focus on is one of my favorites, 1982's The Thing, involving a group of researchers stuck on an Arctic base, dealing with a force that could look like any one of them. The 80s was a time when the AIDS epidemic had gripped the world and people feared that even a handshake could be deadly, and The Thing encapsulated this fear of infection. Initially misunderstood and criticized for its bleakness, The Thing is now hailed as a masterpiece of existential horror. Its shape-shifting creature became a metaphor for every modern fear, disease, identity, and the alienation of a cold, indifferent world. Well, we're nearing the ends of our analysis, and obviously we didn't have time to go through every horror era or movie we wanted to include. So let us know and comment if you'd like to see more or want some more recommendations.
You're paralyzed. Just like that day when you did nothing. You did nothing. Now, sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
And now we have reached our current era, what many have deemed the era of elevated horror, which takes us from the 90s to present day. Films in this era often prioritize a story with deep themes, emotional complexity, and realistic performances. They can be self-referential and are frequently characterized by a muted, artistic visual style, common in realism, but sometimes also due to the mid-tier budget that studios like A24 often assign to these films, while the bigger budgets are reserved for blockbuster franchises with more capitalistic potential. Some believe this name undermines other horror eras as unelevated or less significant, but this is far from the truth, as it's those pioneering works that have elevated horror to where it is now. We start with 1998's meta-horror Ringu, directed by Hideo Nakata. It's a horror film about watching horror films. The cursed videotape literally kills those who view it, an ingenious metaphor for horror's own mental effects on its audience. The idea that evil could spread uncontrollably through technology made Ringu both a horror story and a commentary on how media multiplies fear, mirroring the current technological anxiety of our times. Next, we take a look at Hereditary, directed by Ari Aster in 2018. This film transformed domestic grief into a supernatural ritual. A family's inherited trauma becomes their reckoning. Mental illness, guilt, and obsession are morphed into an occult evil that is inevitable. The ghosts of our family have already chosen us, and we can no more run from them than we can our own blood. And finally, the last film we'll look at is Ryan Coogler's 2025 triumph, Sinners. The story unfolds like a Southern Gothic confession. Churches, crosses, old hymns, but beneath the ritual of faith lies centuries of buried violence as the film confronts one of America's oldest sins, racism. Released in a time defined by protest and polarization, Sinners channels the collective unease of a generation facing systemic injustice. It involves vampires of a very specific skin complexion, white, as they tear down any chance of survival that the black residents have. The elevated nature of this horror reveals a generational evil that is incessantly passed down and yet continuously denied.
This world already left you for dead. Won't let you build. Won't let you fellowship. We will do just that. Together. Forever.
So if it hasn't become apparent by now, it's obvious that horror endures because it isn't afraid to tell the ugly truth. A truth which has changed with us from generation to generation, holding on to the things inherent to us buried deep within. Because fear is not the enemy of humanity, and instead, it's proof that we're still alive to feel it.